I'm Tracy Austin, your host of the People Strategy Podcast. This show provides interviews with organizational leaders and ongoing coaching experiences that highlight elevating people in organizations through a people strategy roadmap.
And you might create more problems because you're trying to solve for all these things where you really don't need to be focusing, and it just either opens up a new can of worms or creates new conflict within the team dynamic. So really having a clear problem to solve for helps the resolution and the timeliness of that resolution.
Welcome back to the People Strategy Podcast. My name is Tracy Austin. We are diving into the latest trends and best practices in talent management and organizational development. Today, we are chatting with Adam Gruszcynski with Potawatomi Casino Hotel, and we are on episode 7 of our leadership development series. So if you've not been following our series up till this point, you will note that we are going to reference back probably the entire conversation. So today, we are talking about problem solving and critical thinking. And so with that, Adam, welcome back to the People Strategy Podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me again. Looking forward to continuing this awesome conversation about leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I find with leadership is that definitions and clarity of the definitions of what we're talking about is incredibly important. And it tends that if we don't sit down and define and ensure that there's understanding from all parties, we tend to collapse things and have conflict, which we talked about last week. So I'd love to just start with what the definition is of conflict resolution, problem solving, and critical thinking. So here's what Oxford Dictionary stated. So conflict resolution is the methods and processes of negotiation, arbitration, and institution building, which promote the peaceful ending of a social conflict or war. Well, that's an interesting definition. Problem solving is the act of finding ways of dealing with problems. And then critical thinking is finding solutions to difficult issues, or the act of finding solutions. So there's these nuances in between the three. So critical thinking is really about, all right, let's figure out what are all the different ways that we can do this to look at it from multiple areas. Problem solving is really the act of doing it. And conflict resolution is the process within the people of how we're going about doing that. And I know you've got a great example of this to make this actually come into reality.
Yeah, I think you and I have talked about it before, but one of the biggest problems I encountered when I first took this position is there are 6 teams that report up to the IT director, and only 3 of them had managers. The other 3 were managerless for various reasons. So in the interim, not only did I have the responsibilities of doing my job as the director of the department, but I also needed to make sure that the teams did what they needed to do and kind of, co-manage them as well to make sure that everything they needed to do got done. And that is a great, short-term solution, but is not viable long-term. You're going to have burnout. Things are going to get missed. The overall satisfaction of the team isn't going to be healthy because they don't have a direct report to go to. So, I thought about how can I solve this problem? And I thought one of the easiest ways to do that is to become active on LinkedIn and promote how great of an organization Potawatomi Casino Hotel is to work for, how great our IT team is here as a department, and was trying to sell things that I wasn't seeing other IT companies do to try to get people to take notice of what we were doing here to help try to get really quality applicants apply for these managerial positions. And I was able to fill them within a short period of time and have people that, really kind of bought into what I was looking to do and change from what was previously done. And I think it's worked really well here. I mean, all 3 of those hires are still here and they're still going strong. And it's something I took great pride in trying to find the solution to this problem that I had.
Yeah. And what I love so much about this is you just show kind of all 3. That critical thinking is what's another way that we can solve this that we may not have thought of before? Right. And what resources do I currently have available? Right. We're not talking about going and spending thousands of dollars and bringing in all these things. It's like LinkedIn is at my fingertips. I have influence within LinkedIn and I've got a story to tell. How do I use that in order to do it?
Right.
So, and then, the problem was clearly identified. And I think that we've talked in previous podcasts a little bit about more of what that problem was, like lack of work-life balance. You're trying to do those 3 jobs, as you just mentioned, but there was a negative impact of not having the staff for the organization and your team, which leads to burnout. So you're solving multiple problems within that, thinking, critical thinking, what's all the ways that we could solve it, utilizing facts, then the problem. Now, the conflict resolution. Tell me a little bit about the conflict resolution and where was conflict up to this that led you, because a lot of times the conflict is what creates the critical thinking that creates then solving the problem.
Yeah, I think the conflict was just simply my availability to the team members of those teams. Like they need to bounce something, off their direct management, or they have a question, or there is a problem and they need to escalate it. And I was that point of escalation. And with what I had going on and all the various meetings or things I needed to do, I wasn't necessarily always readily available or easy to get a hold of to talk to. And as we've stated throughout this podcast series, clear communication is a linchpin to success in leadership. And if you can't have that, you're going to have conflict and you're going to have issues. And it's not like they were, angry with me or short with me. I mean, they were very understanding of what the situation was, but they were, it was just causing timeliness issues of being able to get things done or escalated or communicated quickly because I was not available. And having that layer in between is really what was identified as needing to have to solve this conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that linkage between conflict resolution, because we talked about 4 types of conflict last week, of being, task conflict, process conflict, status conflict, and relationship conflict. So when we look at that, if we see the conflict coming up there, that leads us to saying, hey, how do we think differently about this to remove the task conflict or to remove, that relationship conflict, or coach folks so that we can move that forward, right? And there was, and I love my gratitude for our past podcast guests, but Bobby Sue Woke talked about, how to coach folks to move forward within relationship conflict. So if that's something you're dealing with now, that might be a good one to look at. But kind of going back is when we can identify what it is, now we can start honing in on specifically what that is to think critically about it to solve the problem. And if we don't have a clear problem to solve, we're trying to solve for all these things and we don't end up solving anything.
Right. And you might create more problems because you're trying to solve for all these things where you really don't need to be focusing, and it just either opens up a new can of worms or creates new conflict within the team dynamic. So really having a clear problem to solve for helps the resolution and the timeliness of that resolution.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I get the question a lot in our leadership program around critical thinking and problem solving. And the question is, well, everybody does critical thinking and problem solving, right? And the answer is no, right? Because what we see is that great leaders have the critical thinking piece of it, whereas we're all solving problems. But if we aren't really looking at what are the impacts of how we solve the problem, we can essentially create additional problems, which is what you just mentioned.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's even more applicable in the information technology space, because from a leadership, you have, you're responsible for people on your team, but from a technology standpoint, you're responsible for all the technology that makes your business run. And we use those terms like critical thinking and problem solving to solve technology problems as well, where the problem might be, this particular technology is not working. So it's, allowing guests not to do a thing, which is a big problem. And you could, hey, I can solve this problem real quickly, but sometimes if you don't critically think through what you're doing, like, is this the best way to do it? Is it the most efficient way? Will it get it back up as quickly as possible? If I do this, I'm creating this problem down the road that might not pop its head for 2 to 3 weeks, or maybe it'll pop its head immediately that I then have to solve, but it's better because we resolve this problem and the guests can do something. So from a technology standpoint, I find it, I don't know that fascinating is the right word, but there's a clear linkage between, leadership, problem solving, critical thinking, and how that is also mirrored in the technology space.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you're kind of talking through that, it is, what are the unintended consequences of the decisions or the problem resolution that we're creating that may create those additional items that we haven't thought of yet? And with critical thinking as a leader, I think a lot of times it's slowing down enough to ask some of those curious questions. As we know, the coaching piece of this becomes so important, as we talked about in week 2 of this series. So I'm curious, do you have some questions that you may typically ask that really allow folks to start thinking critically before they start solving the problem?
I have a technique that I may have stolen from a podcast you've done that I have not been able to use often yet, but it's in my back pocket and I'm just waiting to spring it. But I think it's called the 1-3-1 method or something like that, where you have your problem, and then as a leader, you don't necessarily always want to come up with the solutions. You want to help coach the people who are trying to solve those problems to get to that solution and help build up their confidence and their ability to critically think through and solve problems. And that the 3 number comes in is, all right, you have your one problem. What are your 3 different ideas to solve that problem? And then out of those 3 ideas, we're going back to the 1, what is the best way to solve that problem? And you're putting the onus on them to think maybe outside the box and think a little critically, that I know I can solve the problem this way, but if I'm being asked to come up with 2 other ways to do it, now I have to sit down, re-examine, slow down, and actually take time and analyze the situation a little bit more thoroughly to come up with those other 2 solutions. And then if I'm saying, all right, you present me the 3 solutions, now which one do you think is the best to move forward with? I'm coaching you to think critically that, all right, out of the 3 I spent time thinking about, what is the best one? And maybe as the leader coming in, they might not pick the best option. They might take option 2, which is a viable option, but might not be the best one. And that's where your coaching comes in to say, well, that is a great idea, but what happens if we look at, this option, and kind of just sit down and talk through, what the final decision may be. The other thing I like to tell people when I tell them to think through the problem is, stop and walk away from the problem. Sometimes if you think about it too much, that can be bad. Where sometimes I joke with my team that I'm not even thinking about something, and I'll be at home in the shower or cutting the grass, and like that light bulb moment comes up in my head that, this is, I think, the solution to the problem. Let's go. I'll shoot myself an email so I remember it when I get back to work, and then I'll sit down and discuss it, with the members of the team or the business units and say, hey, what about this? And sometimes just removing yourself from the problem from a little bit and allowing yourself some space and your brain to wander and do other things is also a helpful technique.
So I love what you said, and I want to recap it with a couple bullet points, right? So one of those is, when we step away from something, we take the pressure off. And a lot of times that's where some of those best decisions or insights come from, because you've created the space for the creativity to kind of come in. So that's stepping away from the problem. The second one is that problem is not solved by ourselves in a vacuum. I heard you say several times, I came back and we collaborated with our team. I came back and we collaborated with our team. I brought it back to the team. I asked them to come up with solutions, and then we talked about it, right? And we had the challenging of each other in it, knowing, hey, there's multiple competing priorities here to go back to it. I also heard you say, let's define and agree upon what exactly the problem is. What is the problem that we're actually solving? And one of the questions we like to ask is this actually a problem that needs to be solved? Another question I love to ask is, so what? So what if that's the problem? Does it have the impact? So that so what question can be kind of flippant, but it's like, all right, so what if we solve it, or so what if we don't? What are the impacts of it? And then we see, where does this fall on the priority scale of problems to solve? Right. And does it come up to the top or go further down? Because prioritization is something we had talked about previously, but that can help us really coach and lead our team as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you kind of summing up with, is it a problem that needs to be solved now, is also a key piece of information. Specifically working in IT, things break all the time, and you can't fix everything all at once. You really have to take that step back, is this something that needs to be solved now, or can it wait a couple hours till this afternoon when I have more free time, or can it wait a week? And being able to step back and critically analyze the importance of the problem, and in reality, is it that important, is a huge piece to helping, problem solve and thinking critically.
And as we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, definition is so important.
Mhm.
And so what we've seen a lot of our teams do is they've actually set up a criteria of, you know, is it above X dollar amount of impact? Does it impact X number of people or more? Does it, like literally a list, so that we now have, in a way, a decision tree as to what this falls into, which helps support brand new team members coming in and training them. Because what we're doing is we're teaching them the thought process to begin with, and then we can start to ask the questions where it becomes much more organic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, within the IT space, there's tools called ITSMs, which help IT departments manage problems that come in. And we've recently switched to a new product. And one of the things when you call in with the problem is we, put a score to certain values. Like, is it just one person, or is it an entire department, or is it everyone in the organization? Is it the entire application that's broken, or is it just, a feature or a subset of the application? And we assign numerical value to that. And that helps then at the end determine, is this important where everybody's got to stop what they're doing and fix it now, or can it wait? And there are tools to help that, in the IT space. And that's, I think, a nice example to complement everything we've been talking about.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And as we work with our clients on laying out that people strategy roadmap, we're essentially looking at it and saying, what areas of your people strategy have the biggest impact on impacting your business results? And that's where we want to focus first. And it's not the same in every organization, right? And so understanding what is the impact of focusing here on the end result that we're trying to get.
Yep. And you made me think of a good point, that we always talk about clear communication and talking well to help express what you need to get done. And this example, when you prioritize things, it is always helpful to let the people know who have the problem, where it is in the prioritization list, so that they have a clear understanding of when they can expect the problem to get solved. Because if you don't have that clear communication, they're just going to constantly be on you to be like, hey, when is my thing going to get fixed? Or when is this thing going to get done? And that can also lead to conflict that is unneeded. And if you are in that situation, look at our previous podcast where we spent the whole time talking about how we can resolve conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a really good spot to pause for our sponsor break for our leadership development program.
The People Strategy Podcast is sponsored by the Leadership Development Program offered through Elevated Talent Consulting. Do you have folks in your organization that have just been promoted from the doer to the leader? Well, we have a program specifically for you that trains on the specific ways for an individual to be a leader versus to be the doer of all of the things. In this program, we partner with learners to experience and create their own leadership around time management, delegation, coaching, accountability, and change management. Head to the link at the bottom of this page to find out more and sign up.
Before the break, we were talking a little bit about, the conflict resolution, problem solving, and critical thinking into that. And so one of the concepts that, we talk quite a bit about in our leadership development program is this idea of problem-led leadership. And so I know that this is something, Adam, that you do quite a bit with your team. Do you have an example of how you focus on the problem as you're coaching and leading your team?
Yeah, I mean, as we talked about, having a clear understanding of what the problem is and how that problem impacts the organization, the business unit, you have to set that clear boundary. So oftentimes when I'm talking to my management team or individuals, establishing what the problem actually is and making sure everyone involved in the conversation is on board. You have to do that, number one, because if you don't, you're just opening up for misunderstanding, which is not helpful in the situation, especially if it's something that's very critical. After that, we just have to talk through what the problem solution could be, and going from there, what are the pros and cons of doing what we think is the solution? If we don't do that, there is possibility that we could cause more problems unintentionally, and make the matter worse. And just having an open conversation with those involved is really the simplest way and the most effective way to solve that problem. And then, as I mentioned before, also communicating to the people that are experiencing the problem or having not the ideal situation, and clearly communicating to them, when we think the problem will be solved, what we're going to do to solve the problem is also huge. And then from an IT perspective and things we experience, when we think we're going to have something done, sometimes things happen and we can't meet that deadline, and that's okay. What's not okay is not communicating that deadline isn't going to be met, and communicating when we think the new deadline will be. That was a skill I had to learn very quickly, that I was not something very good at the start, and got a lot of feedback from business partners saying, hey, it's okay, we understand things happen, but if you don't set new expectations, we're going to wonder what's going on, and we're going to be on you to ask for updates where you could be spending your time more wisely trying to help bring things along instead of communicating to us. So if you're not going to meet your deadline, let us know as soon as possible so we can make plans too, because sometimes we need to change what we're doing to allow for the extended deadline. And that all goes back to communication.
Yeah, absolutely. And I absolutely kind of love what you're saying about that communication piece. So I'm going to pull out a couple of bullet points that I heard in that. Does that work?
Absolutely.
It's like you're letting the problem lead versus letting the people lead, right? We're focusing on here's the problem and we're agreeing that this is the problem that we're solving. You talked about the collaboration previously and really working with your people to understand what that is. And communication is a key piece to that collaboration, listening into the requests. Hey, total grace in knowing stuff happens and changes at 500 miles an hour. And just let us know what's up so that you're not defending it, but you're allowing us to support you because we want to.
Right. It's almost being more proactive in the communication form when you're not going to meet whatever the deadline is. And I will say, when we say communication, it doesn't have to be verbal. There are many forms of communication. It could be an email, it could be a text message, but as long as you're getting the wording to them, it can take many forms.
Yeah, absolutely. And guess what? I mean, you're in IT, you have your IT systems. I mean, I get so many IT messages from Predictive Index saying, hey, this component is down. It's a level 1. We all know what that is. It should be up by this time. Then I'll immediately get, an update when that changes or whatnot. So there's communication systems that can be built in to your infrastructure as well.
Absolutely. Yep.
And it's working that problem tirelessly and seeing where is the problem leading me versus where do I think I need to go with the problem. And sometimes we get so caught up in looking at and saying, how does this look to others versus I'm just going to follow where the problem's leading me and trust that it's taking me in the right place to resolve it. And I think that gets down to ensuring we're following the data and the analyticalness behind that we're not following the emotions to solve the problem, but we're following the data to solve the problem.
Right. One thing I would like to add too is sometimes problems can't be solved quickly, and that's okay. Sometimes they might take a lot longer than you expect. It could be hours, it could be days, it could be weeks, and that's okay. One thing you need to be mindful as a leader is that the people working the problem aren't being burnt out by the problem, that it affects what they're doing in the organization from a day-to-day standpoint, affecting how they're interacting with individuals. You kind of have to be mindful of that it can be stressful on the people who are actually in the weeds trying to resolve the problem too. And, identifying that early before it gets, too bad. Like if you're from an IT perspective, I can give IT examples all day because that's what I do. But like when something goes down and it's a major thing and you're like, oh geez, like it's going to take, 36 to 48 hours before we're fully up. No one can work 36 to 48 hours nonstop. It's not possible. Their body is going to, have physical exhaustion. So establishing a plan where, all right, you're going to work this problem, for 6 hours. After 6 hours, someone else is going to come in. You're going to work with them to bring them up to speed. And then at 8 hours, you're going to go home so you can shower, you can say hello to your family, you can get some sleep. And then we know you're going to need to come back come back somewhat refreshed as much as you can. And we're just going to repeat that cycle. Identifying that, I think also is a big key component to being in leadership, is making sure that the people don't get burnout from working the problem too hard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for naming those. So I'm curious, as we wrap up this session, what were kind of the key high points for you that you want to recap for our audience?
I think it's okay to step away from the problem. Sometimes that's when you can get your most clarity, is when you're not even focused on the problem, and an idea to solve the problem can come to you. Having clear communication and clearly defining what the problem is also crucial, because if everyone does not have a clear understanding of what the problem is going to take significantly longer to solve, and you may cause more problems because there is no clear definition being set.
Amazing.
Mhm.
And I'm just going to circle back to when you first started getting on LinkedIn, doing podcasts and speaking engagements, the problem that you were looking to solve was to fill the empty seats on your team of qualified candidates.
Correct. Yep.
So
Absolutely.
I'll just give a shout out to that. I don't know what positions you currently have available or will, when folks listen to this, but, we will have a link to the Potawatomi Casino Hotel in the show notes as well. To Adam's LinkedIn. So take a look at how he's utilizing LinkedIn to elevate the employee value proposition of, not only his department, but also the organization as a whole.
Sure. And I would like to add to that, just because an organization or a team does not have open positions doesn't mean you shouldn't still reach out and make connections, because it could just be a matter of exchanging messages on LinkedIn or email, or seeing someone at an event and talking and building that relationship, that when something does pop open, that hiring manager might be like, I met this person a few weeks ago. I think he might be a great fit. And they might proactively reach out to you about an open position that you didn't even know existed. So building that network is definitely key in helping fill open positions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
And if you have leaders in your organization that you're like, oh my goodness, it would be amazing for them to learn some of this in more than a 20-minute podcast snip, get some coaching on it. We do have our leadership development program starting about every quarter. So if you're interested in that, all of that information is in our show notes and on our website as well. So we will see you next week for our final session in the leadership development series, which is relating to change management. Have a great week.
Take care. Be good.
Thank you so much for listening today. I'd love to connect with you. If you'd like to connect, you can find me on LinkedIn at Tracy, TRACI Austin, and at our website at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. If you'd love to learn more about our process, please reach out to us. And again, thank you so much for listening and sharing your feedback with us through a review. Have a fantastic day.